Hello, my name is Mary Garrison, and I would like to welcome you to the Macon County Continuum of Care Point in Time Count and Housing Inventory Count 2020 Data Report presentation. We typically make this presentation to the community in person at our annual Continuum of Care breakfast every March. But due to COVID-19, we are unable to gather this year, so our team put together this presentation in order to share this valuable data with you. You will notice on each slide a picture in the lower right corner of your screen indicating who is speaking for each slide. With that, let me introduce Darsonia Schweitzer, Program Director at Homeward Bound and the Chair of the Macon County Continuum of Care. Darsonia?
Thank you, Mary. The Macon County Continuum of Care works diligently to meet the needs of homeless individuals, veterans, children, and families. These partnerships and collaborative efforts are funded through grants from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Illinois Department of Human Services. The COC Governing Board has expanded in the last year to engage additional partners, allowing us to improve coordination and services for the homeless population of Decatur and Macon County. Dove Inc. is the lead organization for the COC. Now I'll hand it over to RJ.
Hi, my name is RJ Podesky, and I teach management information systems, and I'm also one of the faculty advisors along with Mary Garrison, who you just met recently. The last 6 years have been particularly exciting as Dove has partnered with Milliken and specifically with human service and information systems majors. Through the financial support from Milliken and Dove, we've had over 21 students as fellows during that time. Student experiences such as these are building their resumes while they are in school, giving them demonstrable experiences for future employers. On this slide is our team. You met Mary earlier and now me. We have our wonderful fellows with us this year, Alex Pratt, Ben Maynard, and China Shields. Our agency partner is Dove with Darsonia, whom you just met, and Ashley Garner as well. Fred Spanis serves as our consultant to our team, helping to interpret the HUD rules. Now you're probably wondering why there's an IT guy in the room. This is usually the part where I make a joke about that, and we get some laughter, but not always. But our team does start work right after school starts. This is a great example of a multidisciplinary team where the human service students are learning how databases work and how technology and data fit into their role. And we have our IS students out in the middle of the night performing the point in time count and understanding the needs of the community. Our work for this year has included interpreting changes from housing and urban development and articulating those to the database app that students built years ago. We test those changes with fictitious data. Students make changes to the survey. They train volunteers and how to administer that survey. They assist and coordinate the day of the point in time and count. And they also are in charge of entering the data and generating the reports that eventually go to the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the data that you'll see here later during this presentation. So at this time, I'd like to transition back to Mary, who's going to go over some important terms.
Thank you, RJ. Throughout our presentation, we will be using these important terms frequently. To make it easier to follow the information, we thought defining the terms would be helpful. The first term is HUD, which refers to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which governs the PIT and HIC count. PIT stands for point in time, which refers to the annual count of individuals who are homeless on the particular day of the count, or at that point in time. HIC is the housing inventory count. This is the inventory of all programs that provide beds and units dedicated to serving individuals who are homeless. The last three acronyms are for types of housing. TH is used for transitional housing. This type of housing provides temporary housing for the certain segments of the homeless population and is set up to transition residents into permanent, affordable housing. Next, ES refers to emergency shelters, which provide a place for people to live temporarily when they experience homelessness. Lastly, PSH stands for Permanent Supportive Housing, which combines affordable housing assistance with voluntary supportive services to address the needs of those who are homeless and have a serious disability. There are two other forms of permanent housing that we include in the HIC. One is called rapid rehousing. This provides a short period of rental subsidies along with the voluntary supportive services to help persons who are homeless to obtain and stay in permanent housing. The other form is what we call other permanent housing, and it refers to all other forms of permanent housing that are intended for persons who are emerging from a period of homelessness. So we hope those terms are helpful for you as you listen to the rest of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to send it over to the Human Service Fellow, China, to start sharing our point in time and HIC data numbers.
Thank you, Mary. So these are the overall numbers for the 2020 point in time count. There were 135 total individuals who identified as homeless. 82 of the 135 individuals were living in emergency shelters. 30 individuals were in transitional housing, and 23 homeless individuals were unsheltered. I will now hand it over to Alex and Ben to describe some of the graphs they put together to visually represent our data.
Thank you, China. This is Ben speaking. I'm first going to explain how to read this graph of the homeless individuals in Macon County. So on the left side of the graph, we have the number of people, and on the bottom, we have the year, which goes back to 2012. The thick orange line that you see is the actual count of homeless each year, while the thin orange line is what we call the trend line and shows the overall pattern across all the years. So this graph represents the total number of homelessness in Macon County from 2012 to 2020. So as you can see from the thick line, there was about a 20% decrease in overall homelessness from 169 people to 135 people from 2019 to 2020. The trend line continues to decrease as well, as overall homelessness has gone down in Macon County in the past 8 years. And with that, I will hand it back over to China for the next slide.
This graph represents the total number of individuals that were unsheltered in Macon County. As you can see, there was a significant increase of over 100% since last year. In 2019, we had 11 individuals, and this year it increased to 23. This graph includes a trend line as well, which shows an overall decrease over the past 8 years. I will now hand it back to Alex, and he will tell us more about the weather data they had gathered from the night of the count.
Thank you, China. So this graph that we have is comparing the homeless count of unsheltered to the average and low temperature on the night of the count. So the green line that you see on the graph shows the low temperature. The yellow line shows the average temperature. And we really wanted to take a look at this graph to see if there's any correlation between temperature outside and the number of unsheltered homeless within the area. Although it looks like over the past couple of years, there has been a slight correlation, when you take into account all of the data that we've collected, we cannot visually see any correlation between the temperature on the night of the count and the number of unsheltered homeless that we count. So I'm now going to pass it back over to China, who's going to discuss the chronic homeless numbers for this year.
All right, thank you. This graph represents the total number of individuals experiencing chronic homelessness in Macon County. These are the individuals who have a disabling condition and experience homelessness for the last 12 months or 4 times in the last 3 years, totaling 12 months. As you can see, the number of chronically homeless individuals in Macon County increased slightly from last year, from 25 to 28. It's important to note that 18 of the 28 chronically homeless individuals were housed in emergency shelters and the other 10 were unsheltered. We track chronic homelessness at a national level, but also for our community. Individuals experiencing chronic homelessness are the most vulnerable, but also the most expensive. These individuals require the use of more resources than others. Our community has worked extremely diligently to decrease the number of individuals experiencing chronic homelessness in Macon County. I will now hand it to Darsonia.
Thank you, China. The current number of chronically homeless individuals in Macon County as of yesterday's date is 6. Many of the individuals counted as chronically homeless during the point in time were self-reported. After the point in time count, the Homeward Bound Coordinated Entry Team contacted each of the 28 persons and conducted thorough intakes. As a result, several of the self-reporters were found not to be chronically homeless according to the HUD definition of chronic homelessness. These individuals were, however, added to the Continuum Homeless Action Team chat list. We call this the by name list. The chat team meets weekly to discuss resolution and housing progress of the by name list of individuals who have been homeless for long periods of time in Macon County. Chat includes street level outreach workers from many local agencies. Now I'll give it back to China.
Thank you, Darsonia. This graph represents the number of children under the age of 18 experiencing homelessness. Since 2015, there has been a steady decrease of homeless children and families in Macon County. This year, we saw a decrease from last year's total, from 33 to 12. This has been the lowest number of homeless children we have seen since 2017. I will hand it back to Mary now.
Thank you, China. This graph represents the number of homeless individuals who are military veterans. Although we saw an increase this year of homeless veterans from 6 in 2019 to 12 in 2020, we are still seeing a steady decrease of homeless veterans in Macon County over the past 8 years, as shown by the graph trend line. It is important to note that for this survey, individuals self-report their veteran status. Due to this self-report, there may be issues with accuracy, meaning they may not be a veteran or their status as a veteran excludes them from veteran housing, for example, a dishonorable discharge. All veteran housing must verify their status of each person before offering them housing. We followed up on every one of the 12 individuals who are reported being veterans, and we are happy to say as of today, there are only 4 homeless veterans in Macon County. These numbers change frequently, and our organizations do a great job of connecting homeless veterans with housing through our chat team. Macon County has housing available for all veterans experiencing homelessness if they are willing to accept it. Our community is working toward a status called Functional Zero. This status requires our continuum of care to meet specific criteria, including ensuring there are more veterans getting housed than becoming homeless. Further, that when a veteran becomes homeless, they are housed quickly within 90 days. And that veteran homelessness is rare and non-occurring. As a community, we are almost at this functional zero status due to strong coordination among providers. I'm now going to send this over to talk about the housing inventory count. So we collected data on housing resources and entered it in on the Friday after the point in time count. Each shelter and each transitional housing program submitted 2 pieces of their data, their capacity and the actual occupancy of the night of the count. We obtained the same data from the 3 types of permanent housing: permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and other permanent housing. The purpose is to gauge how well our community utilizes its resources. So China, I'm going to send it over to you to share the data.
Right, thank you, Mary. So this chart shows the utilization of emergency shelters. The blue bar represents the number of beds occupied, while the orange bar shows the bed capacity of each shelter. Capacity can be defined as the ideal number of individuals that the building is designed to hold. Occupancy can be defined as the number of individuals who actually slept there the night of the pit count. There are many possibilities to why the maximum capacity was not reached that night of the pit count. Individuals may have found another place to stay for the night, such as a friend's house or some place they considered warm shelter. Or there was also a certain restriction as as shelters. Some shelters have strict rules on intoxication in animals. Others are limited to the services of certain types of people. Moving forward, this graph represents the housing inventory count for each emergency shelter. If you look at the first shelter on the left, you can see that Water Street Mission, which serves adult men, had the bed capacity of 7 and reached its capacity the night of the count. Next, Decatur Macon County Opportunities Corporation's Emergency Voucher Program had the ability to house 4 individuals in a hotel, and they utilized all 4 vouchers on the night of the count. The next shelter is Dove's Domestic Violence Shelter, which serves women, children, and men fleeing domestic violence. They have a bed capacity of 30 and 7 beds were occupied that night. God's Shelter of Love serves women and children, and their shelter on College Street, known as Carriage House, had a bed capacity of 16 and only 3 beds were occupied the night. God's Shelter of Love first location on Union Street reached their capacity of 8 on the night of the count. Next is the Salvation Army Shelter, which serves adult men. They had a bed capacity of 33, which is higher than normal capacity of 30 because of the Code COP program. This program opens 21 additional beds when the weather is below 35 degrees for 5 continuous days. However, on the night of the count, they provided beds for 61 individuals. Next, Youth Advocate Hilltop Shelter, which serves youth under the age of 18, had a bed capacity of 3, but none of those beds was occupied on the night of the count. Lastly, Grace House has a capacity of 8 beds, but only 7 of them were occupied on the night of the count. The 2 shelters that were furthest from meeting their bed capacity are the 2 most restrictive shelters. The Dove Domestic Violence Shelter can only accept individuals fleeing domestic violence, and Youth Advocate Hilltop Shelter can only accept youth under the age of 18 who are homeless. Ben will discuss the numbers for the transitional housing portion of the housing inventory count.
Thank you, China. So this graph represents the housing inventory count for transitional housing. These transitional housing options serve families and single adults, and they all offer apartments or similar houses. Similar to the last graph, the blue bar represents the number of beds occupied, and the orange bar shows the bed capacity. So this graph shows for transitional housing, the total bed capacity compared to the number of beds occupied. So as you can see, only 30 out of the 47 possible beds were occupied. And we'll move on to the next slide to get a further breakdown of transitional housing. So this further breakdown of the housing inventory count is by locations. So first, looking at DMCOC, there were 9 beds occupied out of the 11 beds that they had available. Next, we see that the Dove Transitional Housing Leasing Program had a capacity of 25 beds, and 16 of those beds were occupied. And finally, the Dove Domestic Violence Transitional Housing Program, a program that serves individuals fleeing domestic violence, had 5 of their 11 beds occupied. And with that, I will hand it over to Alex to discuss the next slide.
Thanks, Ben. So this graph shows the total occupancy and capacity of permanent housing options. So like Mary talked about earlier, there are 3 options of permanent housing: permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and other permanent housing. As you can see, the permanent housing, supportive housing had 79 beds out of 83 occupied. Rapid rehousing had 19 out of 27 beds occupied, and other permanent housing had 58 out of 65 occupied. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to take a look at the breakdown of race of homeless individuals this year during the count. So we had 80 individuals identify as white, 51 individuals identify as Black or African American, and 3 individuals identify as multiple races. Additionally, we did have 1 individual identify as American Indian or Native American. Our survey also had options for Asian and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, but no one identified as with those as their race. So I'm now going to hand it back over to Ben, who's going to talk about the breakdown of race by year.
Thank you, Alex. So this graph shows the breakdown of homeless individuals by race over the past 5 years. So as can be seen, the percentage of homeless who identified as white has increased since 2019 and the past years, while the percentage of individuals who identify as Black or African American has decreased slightly. Additionally, the percentage of individuals who identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, and multiple races have all also decreased. And with that, I will hand it over to China.
Thank you, Ben. This graph represents the disabilities reported among the homeless population. Individuals may fit into more than one disability category. Emotional or mental illness was the most common disability among those we had surveyed, with 28 individuals reporting they experienced mental illness. Next, one individual identified as having an intellectual disability. 20 individuals reporting having a physical disability and 27 individuals reported substance use disorder. 2 individuals reported that they have a brain injury and 3 reported having PTSD. Notice these are self-identified disabilities which may not give an accurate picture of the prevalence of disabilities in homeless population. Moving forward, there were 68 individuals reported having disabilities, where 50 individuals reported having one disability, and 18 individuals reported having 2 or more disabilities. It is also important to note that half of the homeless population reported having a disability. I will now hand it back to Alex.
Thank you, China. So the last graph we're going to look at today is the homeless individuals by age group. So this year we had 12 individuals between the ages of 0 and 17 who experienced homelessness, 10 individuals between 18 and 24, 20 between 25 and 34, 27 between 35 and 44, 31 between 45 and 54, and 35 that were 55 years or older. So I'm now going to send it over to Fred, who's going to speak about what's next with the count.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you also, China and Ben, for your work. I'm going to place this in a little bit of perspective. With our point-in-time count and our housing inventory, we participated in a national count of persons experiencing homelessness and a national count of housing resources. This takes place every year towards the end of January. HUD reports the national totals to Congress later in the year as part of its annual report on the status of homelessness. And then Congress, in turn, uses the numbers from the National PIT and the National HIC to help determine legislative changes and help set funding levels for homelessness. Here at home, it's much the same. We use the PIT and the HIC in a similar manner. First, we report the results to the community, which we're doing right now through this video presentation. Next, the Macon County Continuum of Care Board will take a detailed look at the data. This will help us see where we are on the fight against homelessness. What are we doing right? Where are the gaps? What do we need to focus on? What types of housing, what types of services are needed? So the numbers we've reported to you today have implications for how we do our work tomorrow and every day for the next year. So now I'm going to send it back to Mary for our wrap-up.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you to our team. This is really important work, and we couldn't do this without everyone who is here presenting today. So thank you to all of you. We hope this information has been valuable for you. Please know that in the notes of the YouTube video, there are comments that provide further clarification. You may pose a question to our team, and we will get back to you. So following this slide are a few appendix slides with additional information and credits, and we hope you'll look at them. Please do not hesitate to reach out to Darsonia Schweitzer and myself with any questions. Thank you so much, and please be well and stay safe.